Welcome, class. This week's topic is Judiciary, the American court system, Article 3 of the Constitution. In the United States, our courts serve the functions of settling disputes between government and the people against the people, and interpreting our laws. A distinctive feature of our court system is that our judiciary is independent from the other branches. In many other government systems, the judiciary is much more tied to the other branches, especially the executive. So the power of the judiciary in our system is we have laws, and they are going to interpret these laws and make sure they are followed. In democracies that are liberal democracies, which means that we have rights, and the government is there to protect those rights. The judiciary plays the role of making sure those rights are followed and trying to clear up any ambiguities or contradictions. So as is pretty plainly seen, our judges in our judicial system are political actors. They are an institution that is very important for the political direction of the country and on what laws are followed and what laws are deemed unconstitutional, which we'll get into. Our judicial system has many constraints on it. The judges have to follow the Constitution, the laws on the books, precedents, which we'll get into, and just also procedures that have been laid out. The book doesn't talk about it much, but we're going to go over common law and code law. The American system is a mix of both, but common law is very important, and this is where our system is supposed to have impartial interpreters who are judges of unsystematic laws. So we have laws that are not 100% laid out. If you commit this crime, you have to do this many years. It's really not laid out that specifically, so our judicial system relies on precedent. And this is where judges look back on prior court rulings that show how laws have been applied in the past. And that precedent, that former ruling, is going to have a major impact on whatever the current ruling or case in front of a judge. Common law, this is just through history. You go back to England, of just laws not written down, but just cases being heard. And, someone's sheep was stolen, the perpetrator gets 5 days in jail. That they would use that precedent as an example. So this would eventually become into written laws. And with common law, there's three specific types. Statute law. This is where it is a law that's passed by legislature, so it's a written down law. Constitutional law, where if the country like the United States has a formal governing document, this is the highest law and the toughest law to interpret and change. And there's also administrative law, as we've seen in the last section about the bureaucracy. There's lots of regulations and statutory frameworks that get judged on by these agencies and bureaus. And we need a judiciary to make sure they're following the written law. So just think of these common laws as judges or arbitrators in a system where there's precedent and you're trying to determine which is the case, how should we rule in this case based on what's happened in the past. So code law, this is going to be where the laws are more systemic. They're more black and white. Like I said before, if you do this crime, you get this punishment. So the laws are written more specific, and judges are more like semi-bureaucrats, where they're there to do a job, but they're not going to be doing too much interpretation or altering what they think is best for the law. They're going to follow the code, the written law. And just more generally, and your text goes over this about types of law, criminal law. These will mostly be state laws. These have to do with health, safety, morals, burglary, murder, damages. These are going to go under criminal law. There's also civil law. This is where there's no specific crime broken, but it's a dispute between two or more citizens. And of course, public law, which is the same as the constitutional law we just discussed. This is where it's some citizen or a state, and their plaintiff is the government, pretty much challenging something in the U.S. Constitution, or that their constitutional rights were not followed. Just real quick, going over the types of courts. The first court, pretty much anybody's going to be in, is a trial court. If that decision is appealed, it's going to go to a higher court called an appellate court, where they're going to try to challenge the prior trial court's ruling. And of course, finally, is the Supreme Court. Each state has a Supreme Court. And there's also, of course, the federal Supreme Court. So it's a hierarchical system that you can see. The state side, which most cases will be held, trial courts, state appellate, state Supreme Court. Then it can, of course, go all the way to the federal Supreme Court. And the federal court system, which will handle much less cases, the federal cases, and this also has a court of appeals, and it goes up to the Supreme Court. Most cases will be heard, about over 90%, in state courts. These are federal crime these are crime issues. For the most part, small civil issues. If it's a federal law, then it will start in a federal court, or if it has to do between states or treaties, or it's a real constitutional question, it can get moved up to the federal court quickly. The federal court system has 94 judicial districts. We go back before, you saw the federal district courts, and there's pretty much 12 regions, 11 circuit regions plus the DC circuit, which is very important. And there's also some specialized federal courts that have to do with patent law and such. Here are the districts, the regional districts. California is in the 9th district, which is in the news quite often. The Supreme Court, this is the one court that's mentioned in the Constitution. All other courts are created by Congress. It has a Chief Justice. The number of associates is 9, counting the Chief Justice. Along with the Chief Justice, there's 8 associate justices. That number is determined by Congress. They can make it more, they can make it less. It's not in the Constitution how many justices there are in the Supreme Court. And the Chief Justice, his vote's the same as everybody else's, but he has a lot of administrative duties. Federal judges are appointed by they're nominated by the executive branch, president, and confirmed by the Senate. We talked about judicial review before. This is the powerful part of the U.S. court system, where they can interpret a law saying that it goes against the Constitution. And though it was passed by a legislature and executive, this is where the third branch, the judiciary, says those two branches went beyond their bounds, and this is unconstitutional. Judicial review started very early on with the case of Marbury versus Madison, where pretty much a law was passed, the Judiciary Act of 1789, and it gave the power of the court to appoint a judge. And, the court said, hey, we don't have the power to do this. Only the Congress and the executive can do appointments of judges. So this was saying that for the first time, this was saying, hey, this early Congress, early presidency, that they went beyond the bounds of the Constitution, and they say you can't do that. So it's the first time the Supreme Court said, hey, what Congress president did is unconstitutional and invalid. So this really establishes the judiciary as a separate branch of government. And if you want to hear more about the case in a real nice quick video, I have a link for you right there. So judicial review has been used pretty sparingly at the beginning of our country, but as the years have gone by and the government's gotten bigger, it's more into more facets of our life. They've used the court system from the lower courts on, have used it to reverse, state laws, state actions, federal agency, bureaucracy actions, of course, federal laws, congressional and presidential actions, executive orders. Recently, President Obama's order on the DACA was labeled unconstitutional, saying that he went beyond the bounds of his office, doing an executive order without congressional laws. The Obamacare went up several times. A certain part of Obamacare was deemed unconstitutional. That was with the federal government mandating the states had to cover a certain amount of people with Medicaid. But other parts were deemed as constitutional. So this obviously very big issues have come up and will continue to come up under judicial review. There are two kind of ways to look at judicial review and the role of the Supreme Court specifically, because, a federal court, a district court can say something's unconstitutional, but the Supreme Court can, of course, overrule them, as was seen in the recent, I think, the travel ban cases. But here you have the kind of philosophy of judicial restraint or originalism, where your judicial philosophy would be, if it's not in the Constitution, it's not in the Federalist Papers, which describe what the Founding Fathers were thinking, then it's not in there. It can't be, we can't just add it willy-nilly. It's not in the Constitution. We're going to interpret it as being unconstitutional. And then there was more of the judicial activism philosophy, which posits that the court can go beyond the text of the Constitution or law to consider broader societal implications of certain decisions, as can be seen in interpretations of the recent Obergefell for gay marriage and many other decisions, where the court finds pretty much a more broader interpretation of the Constitution. So, just a discussion topic of, how do you view actions of the court? And it's tough to be consistent on this, but do you think it, yes, it should be an active court that is looking to right wrongs, or no, the court is, it's not elected, and it can't possibly represent, of course, when the Supreme Court makes a decision, it affects everybody, all citizens. So, a couple views there. And lastly, here I have a picture of the current Supreme Court, the 9 justices, except one part's wrong here. Anton Scalia on the bottom, second on the bottom row, second from the left, he recently passed away and was replaced by Neil Gorsuch. So that's the one difference here, and that might be on your quiz here. So thank you, class.